city today, so I thought it would be a good opportunity. Now, I hope that this doesn't... No, that's fine. I just want to bring up my map. I'm not moving at the moment. We're parked. So don't worry about me touching things. I just want to find my maps and then we can get going. Well, I want to bring it up. Disconnected. That's weird. Oh, okay, now it's got the maps here. Okay, I can see that now. Good. Alright, sorry about the fumbling around. What the heck? Oh. The bus just appeared behind me. Like, what is that thing right behind me? Oh dear. Alright, let's get going. So, what I wanted to talk about today, I hope you can hear me alright, but if you can't, well, too bad. You just have to enjoy my lovely face as I drive home. What I wanted to talk about is the recent discussion. The policeman just went past a minute ago, and now they're going past again. Oh, there's weird things happening around here. What I wanted to talk about is the recent discussion I had with David Pallmann about dualism, and I wanted to give some further thoughts about that. And share some reflections on the matter. So, I recommend that you have a watch of the discussion if you haven't. I think it was quite cordial and actually productive. We actually made some progress and I think helped each other understand each other's views better, and hopefully gave some things for people to think about. But I wanted to talk a bit more about some aspects that we touched on there that either we didn't get time to go into, or I've been reflecting on further. I wanted to share a bit more about. So the key issue here is the nature of the mind, right? So by mind, we both sort of generally agreed that we mean whatever it is that thinks and feels and perceives and so forth, right? So we're not taking a view at the outset on what that thing is. We're just sort of defining it, I guess, heuristically or sort of functionally. The question is, what is the nature of the mind? And particularly, is it physical, or is it something that transcends or goes beyond the physical? Obviously, my view is that the mind is physical. I mean, I'm a physicalist. I think everything is physical. And David is a dualist, particularly a substance dualist, so he thinks that the mind is immaterial and that it interacts in some way with the physical brain and or body to give rise to like a human person. So he's an interactionist substance dualist. Now, the main argument that David gives for substance dualism is the modal argument. He gives a number of other arguments, and we discussed some, but the one that he finds most convincing and that we spent the longest on is the modal argument. So the version of the modal argument that he presents, excuse me, is the modal argument is pretty much the same thing as the zombie argument, or the P-zombie argument, if you've heard of that, popularized by David Chalmers. It's not exactly the same, but it's very similar, and so I sort of regard them as versions of the same thing. The basic idea of the modal argument, or the P-zombie argument, is to establish that it is possible that the mind could be non-physical, and therefore to reason that it is in fact not physical. So this step here is important because physicalists say that the mind is, well, physical, but what I meant to emphasize is that physicalism about the mind entails modal commitments. So by modal commitments, we mean commitments to positions, not just about what exists or what is, but what could exist or what is possible. And in particular, physicalism is, or at least is normally understood to be committed to the claim, we've got a weird street here that's not parallel, that's annoying. Physicalism is normally understood to be committed to the claim that, or claims like, you couldn't have a physical duplicate of a human body without it also being a mental duplicate. And that's where the P-zombie argument comes in, for example. The idea is, well, if you had a complete down to subatomics, whatever, physical duplicate of a body, then like a human body, then that would also duplicate the mind of the relevant person. So this is a modal claim because it's not saying that we have physical duplicates, it's saying that in any world in which there were such duplicates, or we could somehow produce them, there would necessarily be a connection between producing that physical duplicate and then having or giving rise to a mental duplicate. So in other words, materialists are about the mind are committed to the impossibility of p-zombies, the impossibility, that is, of making a physical duplicate that's not also a complete mental duplicate, including like qualia and experiences and all that sort of stuff, which is what Chalmers discusses. So I'm emphasizing this because it can sometimes become a little bit confusing maybe about the connection between physicalism and these sort of modal propositions about possibilities, or what would exist in other possible worlds. Hi all, I see some messages in chat, not reading, not just see them. What road am I supposed to be on here? I think it's this one. It'll be alright once we get on the freeway. I'm just not used to these back streets very much. The reason I'm driving in today is actually a kind of a funny story, because I intended to catch the train, which is what I normally do, but then the train was cancelled, and then I drove to the station to get the replacement train, but then there was nowhere to park, and I had to be in the city for an appointment. So I'm like, well, if I wait for the next train, I'll be like half an hour late, so I guess I'll just have to drive in. Anyway, so we can use that as an example of modal properties, right? Because we can, or modal facts, because we can talk about what would have happened if I'd caught that train, or if that train had run, right? Presumably there are facts of the matter about what would have happened, and so those are modal facts, right? And so the physicalist about the mind, to bring that back, is committed to certain modal facts, or the truth of certain modal propositions. So this is where David's preferred formulation of the modal argument comes in, because he says the first premise of which is something like, I may not have the wording precisely right, but the first premise is something like, my mind is necessarily either physical or non-physical. And that premise there, we spend a bit of time talking about, and this is the one that I've spent most time thinking about subsequently, but I'll come back to that. But the thing is, most physicalists accept, or at least accept for the sake of argument, that physical entities are necessarily physical, but this is something I'm increasingly thinking is a mistake. But anyway, we'll come back to that. So the second premise then is, my mind is not essentially physical, and then the conclusion from those two is that my mind is essentially non-physical, and wrong lane. I'll just turn it anyway. Oops. And then from that you conclude that if my mind is essentially non-physical, then physicalism is false, right? I mean, that part is fairly straightforward. So the premise about my mind not being essentially physical is demonstrated or established through thought experiments. And so the p-zombie thought experiment will be one, where you can conceive of a physical duplicate of my body that didn't have certain qualia or mental states, so that would be one. David in his video also talks about the idea of it being of body swapping thought experiments, like in Star Trek or something, where people swap bodies. Another thought experiment that we talked about in the most recent discussion was that of the evil demon, the Cartesian demon, that feeds my mind like false perceptions, and so I think that I'm in a physical world, but actually I'm not. Everything is sort of a delusion, in which case I wouldn't have a physical body, so obviously it wouldn't be physical. So there are a variety of thought experiments that attempt to establish that my mind is not essentially physical. And in the discussion, David and I talked about the nature of those thought experiments, what they establish, whether how conceivable are those scenarios, what conceivability means, looks like those two cars just ran a red light, and the relationship between conceivability and metaphysical possibility. So I may touch on those, but coming later. But I want to come back to the first premise, right? Because this is the one that I was really thinking about. The premise that my mind is either essentially physical or essentially non-physical. Because if that premise is rejected, then the rest of the argument doesn't even go forward, right? So I raised the argument that it seems possible that a mind could be, or my mind specifically, could be defined functionally as a bunch of mental functions, thoughts and perceptions and feelings and so forth, which is actually how David defines minds, and I mentioned before that's the definition of minds we're going with. So we're actually defining it in terms of the properties and functions that it has, right? Not in terms of what it's made of. So we start with a functionally defined mind, and then, this is the key step, then we say, well, this mind could be instantiated in different ways. It could be instantiated physically in neurons, it could be instantiated physically in like a classical computer circuit in silicon, at least hypothetically, like for the sake of argument, we'll say that it could be. Or, again, potentially, it could be instantiated in some sort of non-physical form, non-physical substance. And so the point there is that my mind is not essentially physical or non-physical. It is capable of instantiation in different ways. Again, at least that's the idea. And if that's true, then my mind, then the first premise of the argument doesn't go through. Now, David pushed back against this and was arguing that the way that he thinks about a brain, like a physical mind, is that it is a concrete physical object, and a concrete physical object is essentially physical. We went back and forth on that for a little while, and then I sort of realized that David was talking about my mind, because the premise says my mind, right? And he was thinking about that indexically. So like my mind points to the mind that I actually have, right? And I think that this is critical. This is what I've been thinking about. I think that how you interpret this premise is actually going to determine, I guess like a lot of things in philosophy, how plausible you think it is. Because if you take my mind as referring indexically to like how your mind is instantiated, then my mind would refer to like specifically the concrete entity that instantiates that mind. So like it would be a brain, or it would be a computer, or an immaterial soul, or something like that. And the point I'm trying to make is that if you interpret it in a sort of narrow way like that, it would be exactly that thing, like exactly my brain. And that means that it would be essentially exactly that thing. Because obviously my brain, like my bunch of neurons connected together, can't be the same thing as a digital computer, right? They're different things. The claim is that my mind could be instantiated in both, but if you interpret my mind to refer to my brain, then obviously my brain can't be the same as some other instantiation. So this effectively, as I see it, is what's sometimes referred to as the type token distinction. It's so if you imagine two people saying the word hippopotamus, right? In one sense, they're saying the same word. Like I say hippopotamus, you say hippopotamus, right? In one sense, we're saying the same word. It's hippopotamus. In another sense, obviously, we're not saying the same word. One was because one was a series of sounds that came from my mouth in Melbourne, and another was a series of syllables that came out of your mouth in wherever you are at a different time, right? So are we saying the same word, or are we not saying the same word? It depends what you mean by same. It's the same type. It has the same sound and the same meaning, or very similar sound at least, but it's not the same token, right? So the tokens are different, but the type is the same. So I think this is what is partly happening here. My lane is disappearing. That's concerning. Oh, no, it's not. Lines need to be clear here. I think this is partly what's happening here with this premise. My mind is essentially material or immaterial. If my mind is referring to like the token that instantiates my mind, then that's obviously true. Like then my mind is whatever specific concrete particular that instantiates my mind. But critically, I don't think that that's the way we should interpret this premise. I think we should interpret the my mind words there as referring to essentially my mental type, and in which case it would not refer to a concrete particular, it would refer to whatever is instantiating my mind, which could be different things. It could be material or immaterial. Now, why do I think we should interpret it that way? Well, partly it's because of how mind was defined. David and I agreed, and David in his video defined it this way, that a mind is a collection, or sorry, a mind is that which thinks, feels, perceives, and so forth. And for my mind refers to, well, I guess the thing which has my perceptions and my thoughts and my feelings and so forth. So defined that way, it seems inappropriate to then say that when we're looking at the crucial premise here, whether my mind is immaterial, if it is essentially material or essentially immaterial, to then require that the referent of that term be like a specific concrete particular, because that's not how mind was initially defined. It was defined in a way that could be instantiated differently. So I think that this type interpretation fits better with that definition. But I think there's a deeper reason, and this was one thing in particular that I wanted to talk about. So let me see if I can articulate this, because it's sort of fairly new thought. So the dualist has an idea that the same person can exist in different possible worlds, or at least this would be a standard assumption. It would be very strange to say that's not possible, because then you would end up saying things like, it's not possible that I could have been late to work today, because if I'd been late to work, that would be a different possible world, the world in which sort of I'm late to work. And because it's a different possible world, it wouldn't actually be me, because I don't exist in any world other than the actual world, and therefore it's impossible that I could have been late to work. In fact, if there was a world in which someone who looked like me and sounded like me and thought like me was late, it wouldn't actually be me. Like, you could take that view, but that would just be kind of weird. And I don't think many dualists would take that view, because they want to say that the soul grounds personal identity, and they want to say that it grounds personal identity across worlds as well. Exactly how you define what are the essential properties that define identity across worlds of persons, I don't know. I don't think that has easy answers. But anyway, I mean, for the record, I don't think of identity as being really very useful there. I would say it's just relative similarity. But that's fine as a physicalist. Generally, dualists are not very happy with that, because like it's not clear how you define similarity in terms of souls. It's supposed to be like an identical substance, not just relative similarity of physical states. But anyway, I'm getting off track. The point is, substance dualists typically will want to say that the identically same person can exist, or I guess does exist, in or could exist in different possible worlds, like the world in which I'm on time and the world in which I'm late. Now, that means that you can have, if that's true, it means that there are modal properties that apply, modal facts that are true of a given particular person, and can differ across worlds. So, the world in which I wake up on time, the world in which I don't, and the world in which I'm happy that I'm at work on time, the world in which I'm sad that I'm not at work on time, right? That's a mental property that's different of the same person in two different worlds, according to this analysis, right? So, this is important, because when the substance dualist is assessing the referent of the term my mind, it seems like they're not picking out one particular in one possible world. They're actually referring to the same entity across a range of possible worlds. And so they are making a modal claim as well. They're saying, look, here's the entity that's being referred to, and that reference applies in a range of different possible worlds. That means that in order to establish what counts as my mind, you need to make, even the dualist, I'm saying here, needs to make claims about what the scope of my mind refers to in different modal, in different possible worlds. So I'm saying the dualist can't get around the problem of saying what counts as my mind. How far away does it have to be to count as my mind, or what are the principles that determine that, the criteria that determine that? Because again, unless you want to say that my mind only exists in this actual world, in this possible world that we live in, which again, generally people do not want to say, substantialists do not want to say, then they need a theory of in which possible worlds does that exact same person exist, and then in which possible worlds is it actually a different person. Like if you had different parents, well, presumably you'd be a different person. If you just woke up 5 minutes later one day, well, presumably the same person. Well, exactly. Well, what if you had surgery in one and on the other? What if you had? Is it just genetics, or what about if you have one different mutation? You know, you can go down the list. But the point is that the dualist is going to have something to say about this in order to be able to determine the reference of my mind, and then make claims about what properties are essential of that mind, like mind, in some worlds versus other. Like essential properties will be true of it in all possible worlds, and accidental ones can differ across possible worlds. So the dualist has to address this and have answers to that, and they'll have some sort of theory to say, here are the kind of versions or counterparts of me in different possible worlds that still count as my mind. And they won't all be exactly the same. They may have the same, they will have the same essential properties, but they won't be exactly the same. So they're not all identical in all properties, at least. They'll be identical in the essential properties. So the point of all this is that it seems the physicalist then is going to do something very similar. They're going to say the referent of that term, my mind, is not the exact concrete particular that exists in the actual world. It's some collection of concrete particulars that share something relevant in common, like some sort of similarity relation, or whatever it is that you think defines identity over possible worlds. Maybe, in fact, we could define it very narrowly, such that the things that count as me are only those that have a very restrictive range of mental states. But those mental states could be instantiated in different ways in different possible worlds. Again, just keeping it purely physically, there's a possible world in which I exist, you know, with neurons that give that produce my thoughts, and another one in which a mad scientist is simulating me in a computer, right? So those are, but otherwise I have all the same experience and thoughts and perceptions and so forth. And so the idea is that those two copies or instantiations would both be me, but they'd just be me in different possible worlds. And what would make them both me is that they would share whatever it is necessary, whatever essential properties or other characteristics you think are sufficient to define identity across worlds. Again, any theory has to be able to account for this. Some people talk about identity across worlds, or some people talk about counterparts in other possible worlds, but I don't think it matters what exact terminology we use there. And now we're merging, so everyone's squishing together. So the physicalist has to do that in order to determine what is meant by my mind. But as I was saying, the dualist has to do that as well. And this is why I think that you can't then say that my mind refers to the specific concrete particular of like my brain. Because the dualist still has to have a theory of what my mind is, what is the reference of that, what does it refer to, that allows there to be counterparts of you in different possible worlds. So it can't just be this exact version of you in this actual world. There has to be a range of things that it refers to. If that's okay for the dualist, it should be okay for the physicalist, and so they can give their theory about the range of instantiations of you that counts as the referent of the term my mind. Or your mind, you know, if you're thinking from your point of view. So if that analysis is correct, the dualist is forced to allow the physicalist to interpret my mind as referring to any instantiation of your mind that meets whatever criteria there are for identity across worlds. And that can't be so rigid as to make it impossible for you to exist in other possible worlds, because then that would apply to the dualist as well. Now, maybe there's a way around this if the dualist... Like the dualist might say, well, but we can appeal to criteria that are not available to the physicalists for defining identity across worlds. But then they're going to have to say what those are. Like they could say, well, a soul has counterparts in other possible worlds that a physical mind doesn't. But that just seems kind of question begging to me. Like, but why think that, right? Other than trying to defend substance dualism, I think that they're going to need more to say there, in order to make that theory work. So without introducing question-begging assumptions like that, I think that the dualist and the physicalist are in a similar position here of, in interpreting what the referent of my mind is, needing to have theory about what the identity conditions across possible worlds of my mind. And in doing so, that sort of necessarily opens the not opens the possibility, but makes it such that the interpretation of the term my mind is going to allow for multiple instantiation. Now, as an example of multiple instantiation, I was using the example of biological neuron me versus silicon computer simulation me, which, again, theoretically at least, could have exactly the same thoughts and perceptions and feelings, which is what makes a mind, right? So the idea is if two beings have the same thoughts, perceptions, and feelings and so forth over their entire lifespan, well, then they're the same person, right? According to this definition of mind. I've been giving examples of two different physically different instantiations of that mind, but again, I think we can push that thought experiment and say, well, as far as I can tell, right, according to the thought experiment, my mind could also be instantiated non-physically. So maybe there's the physical version of me, which is instantiated in a brain, and in another possible world, not this world, right, but a different world, a possible world, there's the substance dualist version of me. Now, now, if that analysis is correct, the upshot of all this is that the first premise of this version of the modal argument is shot down. It doesn't go anywhere, because the first premise is that my mind is either essentially physical or essentially non-physical. But I'm saying, no, my mind is defined functionally and could be instantiated physically or non-physically. In some possible worlds, it's instantiated physically, and in different ways, in fact, in other possible worlds, it's instantiated non-physically. I think that the dualist has to allow this because, again, of the modal commitments that they have to existence across possible worlds. So they have to be, I think, they have to be willing to accept that sort of modal analysis of the referent of my mind. And if that's true, then the rest of the argument falls flat, because the whole point of the argument then is that we establish that my mind is not essentially physical because of these thought experiments of me being an immaterial mind subject to this Cartesian demon that's giving all these thoughts in me and so forth. But under this analysis, that's actually no, I don't think that sort of Cartesian demon scenario is possible, right? But we're bracketing that and saying, look, if we think that's conceivable and we think that conceivability implies possibility, then we can easily accommodate this in this way of thinking about minds. The possibility of me being a Cartesian demon just means that version of me, the version of me or the counterpart of me in the possible world where I'm subject to a Cartesian demon is a non-physical instantiation. But that doesn't mean that the version of me in this world couldn't be a physical instantiation. All right, just merging in here. Now, the limitations of that response, I should emphasize. So one is that this does mean, if you were to take this line, that physicalism about the mind would not be a necessary truth. That is, there would be possible worlds in which dualism is true. If you buy the rest of the premises of this argument, I'm not saying that the analysis I gave proves that. I'm saying if you took this route and then agreed with the other premises, agreed that, say, these scenarios about Cartesian demons or P-zombies or whatever are conceivable and also therefore possible, that would lead you to the position that physicalism is not necessarily true. It's just true in our actual world. But that actually might be enough for some physicalists. I mean, in general, I would probably want to push a stronger version of physicalism, but I think it's a significant start to say that at least in our actual world, minds are physical. Of course, this argument doesn't establish that, but it allows for that, I should say. But what it doesn't allow for is if you take this line, that my mind can be multiply instantiated in physical or non-physical form, it means that your mind is not necessarily physical, and so physicalism is not necessarily true. It would just be contingently true. But you might be okay with that. So another point here is how this fits with the p-zombie argument. But although it's very similar in construction, the p-zombie argument is a bit different, because remember that in some sense they're the same, but also in some sense inverted. So let me explain. The Cartesian demon argument is basically saying, imagine I had exactly the same perceptions and feelings and memories and thoughts and all that, but in one case I'm actually a physical brain, or I have a physical brain, I am a physical brain, my mind is produced by the physical brain. And the other case, all of those things are an illusion generated by the Cartesian demon. So the thoughts and perceptions are held the same, but the what causes them is different in the thought experiment. So the p-zombie case is in some sense the exact inversion of that. In the p-zombie case, you have physical duplicates, exact physical copies right down to the subatomic level, which then are hypothesized or posited to have different thoughts. And specifically, one is lacking qualia. That's the p-zombie version. So the physicalist, I think, can say that there are possible worlds in which my mind is non-physically instantiated, whilst also denying that there are possible worlds in which p-zombies exist, because those are different claims. One is a claim about whether a physical duplicate necessarily is a mental duplicate, and the other is a claim about whether minds can be non-physically instantiated. So I think you might find it odd to say that we could accept one and reject another of those claims, but it doesn't seem to me that there's any contradiction in doing so. So I could say, yeah, in another possible world, my mind could be non-physically instantiated. It's not in this world, but in another possible world, it could be. At the same time, if we had a physical duplicate of me, then it would necessarily have all my mental states as well. So there's no worlds in which p-zombies exist. That's impossible. So I think that you can just accept both of those positions. At least it's not clear to me that there's any contradiction in doing that. That might be an unusual view, but again, I think it's a live option for the physicalist. So essentially, this has been this is one of the things that I've been thinking about, this first premise, and this connects to a broader issue about the notion of reductionism and the relationship between what you might think of as higher level or more complex properties or states or phenomena, like minds, for example, or consciousness, and what you might call lower level or simpler, more fundamental states of affairs, like, for example, biological systems or chemical systems, or ultimately like atoms and molecules and so forth. Now, the idea that of physicalism, which I think I mentioned in my discussion with David, but I've mentioned in other videos as well, is this idea of level-wise hierarchical ontological reduction. Now, this term reduction is a bit of a tricky one because it's used differently in different contexts, of course. I mean, what is it in philosophy? I want to emphasize by reduction, I'm not talking about into-theoretic reduction, because that is the most common usage in philosophy, talking about reducing theories. But I actually don't find that very interesting, and it's not really relevant here, at least not in my view. So I'm not saying that you can reduce psychology to biology or biology to chemistry in terms of replacing theories in one with theories in another. That's a semantic position about our scientific practice and the meaning of our theories, essentially. I don't really have a view on that. What I'm talking about is something that's called ontological reduction. So this is the idea that something like all psychological truths are made true by biological facts or biological truths. That would be one way of expressing it. A different way of expressing it, which I think gets at the same idea, is to say that all psychological systems are realized in biological substrates, at least currently. I mean, if we build an artificial brain, then that will no longer be true. But at least at the moment, all psychological states or systems are realized in biological ones, and likewise, all biological systems are realized in all biological systems are realized in chemical systems. Chemical systems are realized by physical systems. So this idea of realization I find quite informative. It essentially relates to, so something is realized by something else if a high level is realized in a lower level, if that lower level describes what the high level is sort of made of, the mechanisms that by which the things in the lower level give rise to the phenomena in the higher level, and if all of the truths at the lower level ultimately determine the truths at the higher level. Note that this is a claim about what exists and what makes other things true. It's not a claim about human theory. So there's no statement here about being able to predict the higher level from the lower level or anything like that. So I'm not saying that you could predict from first principles what would happen in biological systems if you just knew all the positions of the atoms. I think that that's probably, well, unless you're actually God, probably not possible. But again, that's a different claim. That's related to inter-theoretic reduction. So this point about realizability. So this is related to philosophy of mind in a number of ways. One is the argument against the identity theory, the idea that your mind is identical to your brain, because of this idea that, well, I mean, my mind could be realized differently. It could not be. It's possible that instead of having a neural brain, I could have a silicon brain, or a different type of brain altogether. So that the same mind could be realized in different systems. This is an argument in philosophy of mind used to argue for what's called functionalism, which is the idea that the mind is a bunch of functions defined in terms of what it does and the properties that it has, rather than in terms of what it's made of. It could be made potentially of different things or instantiated in different substrates, multiply realized, right? Now, I think that dualists still often feel like they're responding to old-fashioned identity theory. I mean, and there are still identity theorists around, but I think that is fundamentally what's going on with David Pallmann's preferred version of the modal argument. Except in that case, all the physicalist needs to do is extend, and we're getting on the freeway and everyone stops, of course, because of the congestion. This is why I don't normally drive into the city. What was I saying? Yeah, so the physicalist just needs to extend the idea of multiple realizability from different physical substrates to also potentially a non-physical substrate. Now, again, I don't think that the mind is realizable in non-physical substrates, but the reason I have for thinking that is due to a bunch of other commitments. It's not because of any facts necessarily about that are relevant directly to the modal argument as such. So that's why I think it's fine to entertain that possibility for the sake of argument when assessing the modal argument. So this idea of multiple realizability is not being introduced sort of ad hoc. It's actually part and parcel of a consistent, in my view, sort of thoroughgoing naturalistic approach to understanding the world. We think about different systems as organized hierarchically with different layers of structure or levels of structure. The mind is a particularly complex one which has many layers of structure, and we're still understanding those better. But the point is that each level is fully determined by and exists in virtue of instantiated in the level below. Hypothetically, as far as we know, those layers could also be instantiated non-physically. I don't think they are, but the physicalist can be open to that from the point of view of the modal argument. And again, if all that analysis is correct, it means the first premise of the modal argument is false. Understanding the mind functionally means that you understand it as possible, as capable, at least potentially, of multiple realization or of different realization, and among those could be non-physical realization. So I think that this is a very consistent approach with developments in philosophy of mind. It's not an ad hoc introduction there. The only difference is that we're now thinking more broadly that it could potentially be non-physically realized. But again, I think that that's actually kind of a good result, that you want to be open to that possibility, at least at this level of the argument. If you want to say that minds cannot be non-physically realized, you want to have different reasons for that, not to sort of rule it out a priori, which I think is the right approach. So I think that in trying to say that physicalists are committed to ruling out the non-physical instantiability of the mind a priori, just sort of by definition or something, I think David Pallmann and others who run this argument is overly restricting what physicalists have to commit themselves to. Now, it's true, again, many physicalists do want to make or at least some physicalists want to make an a priori argument. Other physicalists want to say that it's a necessary a priori. No, I said that wrong around. They want to say that it's a necessary a posteriori claim that minds are physical. And again, I would probably lean to that as well, but for additional reasons. But I don't think critically that the physicalist needs to commit to that for purposes of the modal argument. They can be open to different types of instantiation. And I think that this actually really helps a lot. This notion of realization helps a lot in in dissolving, or at least making progress in many of the major debates around philosophy of mind. A lot of dualists, when they think about physicalism, again, they seem to think about mind as being identical to a bunch of neurons connected together. And that is not how I think about the relationship between mind and brain, nor is it how I think that, the physicalists should think about the relationship between mind and brain. I mean, many other physicalists don't think about it like that way either. We're not saying that your thoughts and perceptions are the same as a lump of cells. What we're saying is the lump of cells is what instantiates your thoughts and perceptions. Now, we can say that there will be a token-wise a token-wise identity. Remember, I talked before about the difference between type and token. So there'll be a token-wise identity relationship between a precisely defined mental state and the precisely defined brain state that is currently instantiated. So, but that's a token-wise reduction. And this is important because, again, presumably your mind is not the same as the token of your mind in this actual world. This may sound esoteric, but remember we talked about this before. What is the speed limit? Okay, it's 100. That's fine. Kilometers per hour for you Americans, not 100 miles per hour. That would be a bit insane. Although I suppose Germans, they're used to that. But anyway, again, unless you want to say that you only exist in the actual world and in no other possible worlds, which few people want to say that, you're not going to say that you are identical to the token of you that exists in this actual world. You're going to say that you're identical to something more general than that has at least counterparts in other possible worlds. And therefore it's completely consistent to say that my mind is multiply instantiable at the same time as saying that the current mental token of my current mental state is identical to a brain state that currently instantiates it. But those are different claims. One is looking at the exact instantiation of my mind that exists right now in this actual world. Yeah, that's token-wise identical to a particular physical state of my brain. But the physical state of my brain, I should say, yeah, my brain and the physical states that it has are not more generally identical to my mind, because my mind could be instantiated differently. It could be instantiated differently, in which case that instantiation would be token-wise identical to its to whatever instantiates it in its instantiation. This is just like, I think I gave the example of this in our discussion actually. I talked about the idea of watching the same movie. So, and it's similar to like the same word hippopotamus as well, right? Like there's no real confusion if we talk about the idea that you and I have seen the same film. Like have you, you might say, I don't know, have you seen Lord of the Rings, right? And yeah, Lord of the Rings is one film. The three are all part of one film, so don't tell me otherwise. And the true version is the extended version, by the way. There's no other version. One is the real version, the others are fakes. Anyway, so I can ask, have you seen Lord of the Rings? Peter Jackson, Lord of the Rings. No one's going to get confused then about whether you've like borrowed my Blu-ray. Well, no, obviously you haven't borrowed my Blu-ray and like watched it in my house, right? On my TV or projector. No one thinks that someone needs to do that in order to have watched the same film, because films can be multiply instantiated. I realize I've turned completely black now, but that's just because there aren't really lights on the freeway here. But I mean, it's the sounds of my voice that are of more interest, hopefully, than my face. Anyway, we understand that a film can be multiply instantiated, that the same film can have different copies can be made in different forms, and that if you've watched any of those, you've watched the film. So there's nothing really peculiar here. The point is that it just feels a bit more peculiar when we're talking about minds, because normally you think that each mind only exists once. And when thinking about my mind existing in different possible worlds, I think we get a bit confused. But I don't really think there's any difference. there's no difference between saying that a film can have multiple instantiations and the instantiation of that film is identical token-wise to, say, the Blu-ray that it's on, like the bumps of the plastic on the Blu-ray, that is the physical instantiation of that film, of that copy of that film, I should say. But the film as a whole is not identical to the bumps on my particular Blu-ray, right? The film is more, I guess you say it's sort of abstract than that. It consists of, it can be instantiated in multiple different forms and still be the same film. My point is that kind of every physical system is like this, at least in principle. It's just that some physical systems we're used to being multiply instantiated, and others we're not used to. And for those that we're not used to, we get ourselves tied up in knots thinking about the weird thought experiments and counterfactuals about what would happen if I swapped bodies or had a condition demon or whatever. What I'm saying is we shouldn't be confused about this. All that we need to define is what it is that defines the higher level state. What it is that defines a mind, well, it's a bunch of perceptions and thoughts and feelings and so forth. Well, if that's what defines the mind, then anything that instantiates those thoughts and perceptions and feelings will token-wise be identical to the token of that mind, whilst not being identical with the type of that mind, because types and tokens are different. Just like the DVD's case, right, or the Blu-ray case of the movie. The Blu-ray is not identical to the movie, but it is token-wise identical to that copy of that movie. So once we understand this, I think that we can resolve most of these thought experiments about the modal properties. Like, we can just distinguish between the instantiation of me that would exist in one world versus in another world, and whether the instantiation of me is physically instantiated or potentially non-physically instantiated. So I think that helps in a lot of cases, actually, in trying to resolve the apparent tension. The tension is resolved by not thinking clearly enough about the distinction between types and tokens, and by the instantiation or realization relationships between higher and lower order properties, or higher and lower order systems. Once you resolve those, I think that these problems largely go away, and that there's no real issue here for the physicalist. Now, again, the P-zombie version of the modal argument is a little bit different, because this doesn't rely on sort of multiple realization in different forms. This relies on the idea that we can imagine an exact physical duplicate. So this would be like an additional token of your mind, except that it was an additional token of your mind. So the analogy here would be, because it doesn't have the mental properties, right? The analogy here would be, imagine that someone made a copy of your Blu-ray, Lord of the Rings, identical to the atomic level, right? Replicates the structure perfectly. But when you put it in the DVD and play it, it doesn't play the Lord of the Rings. It plays, well, nothing if it was a P-zombie, like nothing would happen. And again, the assumption is the Blu-ray player is working perfectly. There's nothing changed about that. The Blu-ray is physically identical. You've just got one that plays and it works perfectly, and the other, you put it in and nothing happens, right? That's the analog of what the P-zombie argument is saying, except the P-zombie argument is saying that about minds. Now, if you were to say that about Blu-rays, I think most people would say that's kind of ridiculous. How can you have an exact physical duplicate of an object and you put it in the Blu-ray player and it just works differently to the other one? Now, as much as it might seem like electronics sometimes work like that, you don't touch anything, you turn it off and on again, and somehow it works, even though like that shouldn't have happened. Presumably that's not really what's happening. It's not an exact physical duplicate. There's something going on there, we just might not know what it is, that differentiates between when it works and when it doesn't work. So my Blu-rays may appear physically identical, but they're actually not. There is some difference, however perhaps slight or strange or unexpected, that determines whether one actually plays in the Lord of the Rings and the other doesn't. You can't have an actually physical duplicate that's precisely physically identical, one that plays Lord of the Rings. People like David Pallmann in the P-zombie argument is that you can have that for people. You can have copies, or at least for bodies, I should probably say, you can have an exact physical duplicate of a body, which nevertheless fail to have all of the psychological properties of the person in question. Because David Pallmann thinks that P-zombies are conceivable and therefore possible. He thinks that you can conceive of, and therefore it's possible that there could be a copy of you that didn't have the same quality that you have, so it didn't feel like anything to be that body. So this is related to what we're talking about in terms of realization and instantiation, but it's coming at it from a bit of a different point of view. As I said, in some sense the opposite from the Cartesian case, because here we're duplicating the physical and saying that the mental is different. Now note that if you understand the relationship between mind and body as that of realization, P-zombies are going to be pretty straightforwardly physically impossible for the exact reason that the DVD or Blu-ray case is impossible. The idea is that the body physically, or the brain physically realizes the mental state. There's nothing to the mental state other than what is physically realized in that your particular brain. And maybe you add interactions with its environment, but that's physical as well, so that's fine. And therefore, if you make a physical duplicate of all of those things, then you're going to also physically duplicate the mental properties and the mental phenomena as well. There's nothing else to the mental phenomena other than what is realized or instantiated in the physical system. So if you believe that the mind is realized entirely physically, then P-zombies are not possible. David Chalmers is, of course, going to argue the other way. He's going to say, well, P-zombies are possible, therefore the mind is not purely realized physically. Maybe it's partly physical, but it's not entirely physical because of the possibility of P-zombies. Here I think this gets more to the issues that David and I were talking about. David Pallmann, by the way, not David Chalmers, that's a bit confusing. That David Pallmann and I were talking about towards the end of our video, because we talked about conceivability, what that is, and then the relation between conceivability and possibility. And there, I was critical of the idea that these scenarios are actually conceivable, at least in any strong sense, because it seems to me as to what someone like Chalmers does when he thinks about these things, is he just thinks about a brain in a very general, abstract way, without thinking about any of the details, and then just doesn't imagine there being any mind there. And to me, that's not really conceivable. That's, at best, a very crude, partial form of conceivability. You haven't actually conceived of all the particulars. And clearly that's not possible. I mean, we don't have enough space in our brain the synaptic connections in another brain. I mean, you need just as many synaptic connections, right, to model all the synaptic connections in another brain. It's physically impossible for us to do that. So the best we can do is approximations. But there's no guarantee that our mental approximations of conceiving of a physical copy of a brain is good enough for us to deduce all of the implications of physically copying a brain. And this is what I don't understand. I really don't understand why people like Chalmers find these thought experiments convincing when it seems to me that you just have to take a leap of faith to assume that our very limited ability to conceptualize these, or to conceive of these, is going to be sufficient for us to see all of the implications of actually having that copy. And in particular, if you don't know much about biochemistry or cell biology, surely it's going to be conceivable for you to imagine having a chemical duplicate of your digestive system, or whatever part of your body, that nevertheless does not have the same biological properties as your digestive system, because you don't see the connection between the chemical properties and the biological properties. Or just like take a single cell, might be even simpler. If you don't understand anything about biochemistry or genetics or cell biology, you might not see the connection between a molecular level duplicate of, let's say, a microorganism, a bacterium. You have an atomic level physical duplicate of that bacterium. You might nevertheless think, well, that could cease to be living, right? It's because you've physically copied all of the atoms. That doesn't mean that it's still alive, because that's a different property, right? You can imagine it having all of the atoms in the same position, but now no longer being alive, because there's something missing, right? There's an explanatory gap between the physical makeup of the cell and the biological properties of the cell. And this is the idea of the P-zombie, that there's this explanatory gap between the physical duplicate and where the qualia come from. But again, it seems to me that this is, and other people have argued this in the literature, this is exactly the same for any sufficiently complex system that you don't understand well enough. You can imagine the lower level duplicate, but not see the connection to whether the high level properties will sort of come along. And to me, that is almost going to necessarily be the case because of the limits of our ability to fully and in all details conceive of things, especially when you don't understand them very well. Which, between you and me, most philosophers don't know much about science. So that only makes it worse. But even for those who do, you can't fully conceive of it. So I'm just really critical of these types of conceivability thought experiments that rely on us seeing the connections between things that we don't understand very well, again, especially philosophers. And I just don't get where they get their confidence in their sort of intuitions. It almost seems that, like, when someone gets an intuition like this, for example, that a physical duplicate, you could have physical duplicates of a person, but nevertheless they wouldn't have qualia. There's always this gap between whatever you say about the neural correlates of consciousness. It's like, yeah, but you could have those functions but not have the qualia. Yeah, but why couldn't I have it to be the case that all of those things that happen in my brain but still it not feel like anything, right? There's always this gap there. I think that people get themselves into this position where it's actually impossible for them to imagine there not being a gap, right? Like they can't even imagine this situation where there could be an explanation, or that gap could be bridged. And I think that's where Chalmers is, right? Because I think that he has just sort of corrupted the way he thinks about this, such that there's sort of necessarily a gap in his mind. He sort of talked himself into because publishing about it for so many years, he's talked himself into the idea that he can't conceive of it differently. But I guess I would frame it in the opposite point of view, like, but why would you expect it to be epistemically transparent to you that there's a connection between like a physical duplicate of a brain and the psychological duplicate of, like, the quality would go along with that? It's just so baffling to me that would be an expectation. So for me, I would say that we should expect there's going to be an explanatory gap, because our brains are too limited, we're too stupid, we're too ignorant about things. I mean, for me, I think the explanatory gap is sort of less, because I know, not to puff myself up too much, but I know a fair amount about cell biology and biochemistry and neuroscience and psychology and all those things. I've studied for many years. Like, there's still far more things that I don't know than I do know, right? I'm still very ignorant. But I know enough for it to be that, little bit less mysterious. And obviously I come from a different philosophical point of view, but like, more fundamentally, I just don't know why you would expect there to be an explanatory connection. For me, it's sort of much more obvious that there would be an explanatory gap. And so we shouldn't be surprised that things like P-zombies seem conceivable to us. Now, depending on how strong a sense of conceivability you think we need, I would say either P-zombies are not conceivable, or they are conceivable, but conceivability doesn't imply possibility. And I mentioned this in my discussion with David Pallmann. It depends how strong you want to get your sense of conceivability. I think David wasn't, we talked about this a little bit, but didn't dwell on it too much. David is still a bit unclear about what the requirements of conceivability are, and I think he needs to think more carefully about this, because it's been widely discussed in the literature, particularly around the P-zombie argument, about what exactly needs to be conceived of. If you think that you need to conceive of, as David Pallmann said, all of the relevant truth makers, it seems to me that we can't really conceive of any of these things because we don't have enough insight into the system. Like, you can't conceive of a physical duplicate of anything as complex as the brain. If to conceive of it, you need to actually sort of mentally picture all of the truth makers, and because there's like trillions of them. Like, you can't possibly do that. Nor do we know all the connections between the different the different truth makers. It's too complicated. We can't even do that, in the example I gave, for prime numbers that are sufficiently big. We can't tell just by looking at them whether they're prime or not. You actually have to work through it. So I don't think David Pallmann there really has a very good theoretical explanation for what conceivability is and how it draws that connection to possibility. I think in order to say that conceivability implies possibility, you have to define conceivability in a very strict way. You have to be able to actually mentally map out all of the relevant details of the system in question and see how they connect to each other. Only then can you be sure that then the fact that it's conceivable implies it's actually possible. And that's kind of what I was arguing. I gave the example of a mental simulation of running across the road. In that case, we know enough about, well, at least most people, who've encountered cars before, know enough about how humans work and cars work and roads work and so forth to know that if you run across the road right in front of a car that's going sufficiently quickly, you're going to get splattered. Like, that's just how it works, right? We don't even need to have seen that to know that that's what's going to happen, to know that that's possible. or that counterfactually that's what would happen. And basically, it's because we can conceive of that scenario, and we have reasons to believe that that conception is sufficiently reliable, sufficiently accurate, and that we have identified the relevant variables there and can model those effectively. That's why we can trust our conceivability in that case. David Pallmann and I talked a bit about the requirements for when we make these sort of modal judgments. I don't really think it's even that mysterious. What we need to do to make modal judgments, to make statements about what is possible, is we just need to understand a given system or a given type of claim well enough in order to extrapolate beyond what we actually have seen. Of course, it's not always easy to specify exactly how well you need to know a system to know it well enough, but that's why science is difficult, right? Even everyday life can be difficult. You make a prediction based on you think something works a certain way, and then suddenly it doesn't work that way, right? Something unexpected happens and your predictions turn out to be wrong. But we can have modal knowledge of degrees. It can be reliable to varying degrees, and it can be generalizable to varying degrees, and it can be more or less detailed in how much precision you have, and how precise you can be, and so forth. So I don't think there needs to be this big mystery about how we arrive at modal knowledge. It's just really a different type of knowledge that requires you to know a system well enough to make extrapolations beyond precise things you've observed. And most of our knowledge really, it takes this form because that's one of the major purposes of knowledge. It helps us to reason in unfamiliar cases. So you need to have modal knowledge to at least some extent in order to be able to do that. There wouldn't be very much use if knowledge only consisted of essentially exact recordings of things that happened in the past and no ability to extrapolate beyond that. I mean, what would you do with that? I guess it would be good for history, but nothing else. So the point is, I think there's no big mystery about how we get modal knowledge. It's essentially a question of cognitive psychology and maybe some general principles of epistemology there about what makes for good inference and how much you can extrapolate and how much not. The problem with the dualists is that they want to extrapolate wildly beyond anything that we know very well. I mean, we don't know the mind very well, and we can't extrapolate very reliably about very complicated systems like this, especially when you don't know much about the neuroscience. Even for those who do know a lot about the neuroscience and the cognitive psychology, it's still exceptionally difficult. But for those who know very little about it, as a lot of the dualists don't know very much about it, I think it's especially difficult. And why they think that these sort of intuitions they have about these thought experiments of brain swappings and Cartesian demons and p-zombies are anything close to reliable enough to use for these sorts of inferences is just baffling for me. I just cannot understand it. And this is in the discussion with David Pallmann where we came to a bit of an impasse because he just sort of was happy to accept these sorts of inferences as reliable, and I just couldn't understand why. And obviously there are going to be further things to say there, he being a rationalist and all, and me being an empiricist. But I mean, even if you're a rationalist, I don't know that justifies these particular sorts of inferences. So that probably requires a longer discussion, but I find that these sorts of arguments very unconvincing when they rely on these sorts of modal inferences that are sufficiently grounded in well-known and well-validated theories, whether those are scientific theories or everyday theories. But brain swap, Cartesian demons, and p-zombies are certainly not in either of those categories. So why think that these intuitions are anything like reliable? We know that we can't fully conceptualize it, this is the big question, and there's no reason to think that we have a sufficiently accurate model to make these modal judgments. So I would just toss them out. I would say that they're useless. At best, they're interesting puzzles, but they don't tell you about what is or is not really possible. So, to recap, this notion of realization, the idea that a complex phenomenon or high-level property can be said to be instantiated or realized by lower-level systems, and that allows for multiple realization, and that this notion of realization can allow you to understand how we can make modal claims about these systems. So you can say, for example, in a different possible world, my mind could be instantiated differently. It would still be my mind because it has the higher order properties in common, same thoughts and perceptions and whatnot, but it's not identical to what instantiates it, and so therefore it can exist in different possible worlds. This notion of realization can allow you to make sense of some of the modal claims that dualists want to make, like the idea that my mind could possibly have been non-physical, and others as well. And this notion of realization also serves as, I think, an argument against the first premise of the David Pallmann's version of the modal argument, that my mind is either essentially physical or essentially non-physical. I think that's false. If we think of it in terms of realization, it could be realized in either way. Again, at least for the sake of this argument. We might want to give further arguments as to why we don't think it could be non-physically realized, but I think that's going to be a further argument and not directly pertinent to the modal premise there. Even if then we accept that first premise, then there's still the questions that I was just talking about how we establish that it is possible for my mind to be non-physical. And the thought experiments of P-Zombian, body swapping, and evil demon variety are just not very convincing, because there's no reason to take those modal intuitions very seriously. What basis do we have for thinking that sort of those sort of conceptions are sufficiently reliable? We think that we can conceive sufficiently in sufficient detail of those scenarios, but how do we know that our conceptions are of that sufficient degree of detail to reliably point to possibilities? I just really never see much discussion of this. Again, the best response seems to be just to say, well, surely you think we have some modal knowledge, and therefore if we have some modal knowledge, well, it must be through conceivability, and therefore these things are conceivable, so they must be possible. But this is just a classic mistake of philosophers of forgetting that there can be a spectrum, right? It doesn't have to be all or nothing. Yeah, we can have some modal knowledge when when we can conceive sufficiently in sufficient detail, and we have sufficient reason to think that those conceptions are reliable, and that our mental models are reliable and can be extrapolated in certain ways. In those cases, we can have modal knowledge, but it doesn't mean that in every case where you think you could conceive of something, or where you could describe it verbally, that doesn't mean that all such cases point to genuine possibilities. Philosophers, I think, far too readily make this sort of mistake. So I think we can very readily answer that objection. So what I think David Pallmann is left with is a bunch of intuitions about possibilities. Oh crap, have I missed my turn off? There's another possible world, the world in which I actually made my turn off. Bugger. Alright, well, we'll see where this road takes me. I was going to say, where David Pallmann is left with is a bunch of intuitions about things that he thinks are possible based on his conceptions of things, and no real justification for why those conceptions should be taken seriously, or why they're reliable pointers to genuine possibilities, as distinct from epistemic possibilities. I just really struggle to take those sorts of intuitions seriously, especially when, as we discussed at the end of our interaction, the dualist, I mean David Pallmann, and I would say almost all substitutalists, just have no actual theory. They have no actual theory for how substitutalism is supposed to work, how the soul is supposed to interact with the mind, where souls come from, how they're individuated, what is it that means that they interact with one and only one body, why they interact with only bodies and not other types of physical matter, how we can integrate the notion of interactions with the soul with our quite detailed mechanistic understanding of the properties of brains and neurons and neurotransmitters and so forth. They've got none of it. They've got nothing to say about any of these things. And all they have to say is, well, the thought experiments are just so convincing that it overrides any of these considerations about the lack of explanatory depth here. But really, are the thought experiments that convincing? The thought experiments are based on wild extrapolations of very poorly understood concepts. Like, oh, I could just imagine a demon that just gives me all my perceptions. Like, we haven't actually imagined any details there about, and this is what I mentioned, about how that's supposed to work. What causal powers is this demon specifically supposed to have, and what is it that determines when and when they give you specific perceptions? And is that how a perception works anyway? Like, what substrates do you need for there to be, for minds to be instantiated? Like, do we know about that? Maybe it's like the case of the microorganism, where we just don't realize that a physical duplicate would also be a biological duplicate, because we don't understand the relationship between chemistry and biology well enough. There's all sorts of these questions that are just brushed aside by these thought experiments, and it should be taken very seriously. And all in all, the people who advocate for these sorts of thought experiments, and intuitions about them, are just way too credulous about their own intuitions and their own mental capacities. I just don't know why they don't ask themselves more skeptical questions about, are my intuitions about these things really that reliable? Do I really have any idea about what I'm talking about? Not only do they think that they do have a good idea about what I'm talking about, but they think that their intuitions are so reliable and the resulting inferences so robust that it overcomes all of the problems of dualism that I mentioned before about all the things that it can't explain, that they could brush all those under the rug because, well, they're just sort of not that important. They're fairly trivial compared to the strength of these intuitions. So this is sort of why I find dualism, just substance dualism about the mind, to be just incredibly unconvincing, because it has no explanatory theory, and the only thing that has going for it is these thought experiments and intuitions about them, which we just have no business for taking very seriously. And even those, I think some of them can be resolved, even preserving the intuitions, by appealing to multiple realizability. As I said, I think David Pallmann's version of the modal argument can be resolved in that way by rejecting the first premise. David Chalmers' version of the P-zombie argument cannot be rejected in that way, or at least I don't think the physicalist should try to reject it in that way. They just have to reject the possibility of P-zombies. But all David Chalmers has going for him there is, well, it seems to me they're possible, bro. Like, trust me, bro. My intuitions are really reliable, bro. By the way, John Searle is, I think, just as culpable here, although he's not a dualist. At least he says he's not, but I don't actually understand how his position is supposed to work. So he thinks that he's the developer of the famous Chinese room argument against computationalism about the mind. But it actually goes beyond that, because as I learned fairly recently, John Searle also thinks that a precise digital simulation of the mind, or as far as I know, even if it was like instantiated in circuits directly, not even just simulated on a von Neumann machine, but anyway, but a precise replica of the brain at the level of individual neurons, or even below, like an arbitrary level of precision, as I understand it. He thinks that would not understand anything, not even consciousness. Not even talking about consciousness. We're actually talking about understanding, which is what was relevant to the Chinese thought experiment. So the initial version of the thought experiment is a guy in a room full of books, the books providing instructions for which symbols to write on a piece of paper in response to given symbols that are pushed through the door. The idea is that the person on the outside just sees symbols coming out that looks like the guy in the room knows Chinese, responds intelligibly, but in fact he's just copying things out from the books. He doesn't understand a word of Chinese, right? So that was what the initial version of the thought experiment is supposed to establish, that just mechanically following rules is not sufficient for understanding, at least at that level of abstraction. And I agree with him. I don't think that the man in the Chinese room, or even the man in the Chinese room together, understands Chinese, because I think understanding requires more than just syntactic following of rules at that level. I think you need the right cognitive architecture, the right functional substrate in order to count as understanding. We could talk about the right mental representations, to use a word that will make visual nurses upset. But the point is, that's one thing to say that system doesn't understand Chinese. But John Searle takes it further, and he says that no, as far as I understand it, he says that no synthetic replica of the brain of any degree of precision or detail would understand Chinese, or would understand anything for that matter. He says that it's some special causal power of brains, or of neurons, or of nervous systems that allows for understanding. I'm coming off the freeway now, so you might see me again. It's like the second coming. Anyway, so I think that this is an exceptionally implausible position. As far as I know, he really hasn't said much of anything about the nature of this special causal power. He says, it's up to neuroscientists to discover, which I think is a ridiculous thing to say, because overwhelmingly, neuroscientists say that, quote-unquote, special causal power is information processing. Yeah, maybe a certain type of information processing, a certain way of information processing, but nonetheless, it's information processing. But John Searle thinks that's wrong, because he rejects computationalism. So on the one hand, he wants to say, I'm not going to tell you what this special causal power of nervous systems are. I'm going to let neuroscientists tell me. And then when neuroscientists tell him, or at least the overwhelming majority of neuroscientists tell him, some type of information processing, he still wants to say, no, that's not what it is. It's got to be something else, because, again, his intuition tells him that no form of symbol processing of any type, of any way so described, can be sufficient for understanding. Possibly should have gone through there. It's a bit of a fast break, but that's fine. But anyway, the point is that I don't think that symbol processing is necessarily the best way to think about how understanding emerges in the brain, although I think that symbol processing is occurring. That's a fairly abstract level of description. But I think that this, again, comes to the issue of realization. I think John Searle's getting confused between different levels of description based on the idea that different substrates can physically realize the same higher level, or the same higher level phenomena. So I think that human minds can be realized, at least in principle, I'm not saying right now, but in principle can be realized in biological brains or in at least certain forms of computers. And the reason that's possible is because what it is that makes something a mind is a very higher level phenomenon. It's thoughts and perceptions and feelings and so forth, and that can be realized by different lower level substrates. To take it to the extreme, you could imagine just constructing a synthetic duplicate of neurons and wiring up a brain out of those. Looks like I've got spammers on my stream. I don't know if there's any mods who can deal with that, but since there's only 12 people at the moment, probably not. But that's right, I'm nearly home, so I can delete those. Apologies if that's distracting from the viewing experience. Anyway, so I think John Searle's getting confused about levels of description here. Just because we can describe computationalism abstractly in terms of symbol processing doesn't mean that at the level of neural realization that's all that's happening, and it doesn't mean that at any other level of realization that's all that would have to happen. There can be a lot of constraints on the way that symbol processing occurs, and those constraints, for example, the nature of their mental representations and the way that they are combined and so forth, that could be wherein understanding emerges, and that's where I think it is. I mean, there's more to say about that. But so I think that John Searle is also, although not a dualist, is also falling prey to the same problem here. His intuition about symbol processing has overwritten anything else, it seems, and he's just relying solely on that intuition in order to justify his view that no type of physical system apart from neurons can possibly understand anything, or can instantiate the phenomena of understanding. So I'm very critical of him there as well, because I think he's making the exact same problem, the exact same mistake, despite the fact that, that he claims that he's willing to listen to what neuroscientists have to say about what those causal powers are. I think that this is really quite inconsistent, to be honest. Anyway, so I think this notion of realization is quite powerful and helps us avoid a lot of problems and confusions. It's a core concept that I'm appealing to in my book that I'm working on about naturalism. So the idea is that many of the things that people think are inconsistent with a physicalist worldview are just complex phenomena that can be realized physically, and realized physically in different ways, just like minds can be realized physically in different ways. Likewise, I think that abstracta are another example of the same thing, like logic and numbers and propositions. They can be realized in different physical forms, but that doesn't mean we have to reify the abstracta themselves and talk about some sort of Platonic object. Obviously, that's a bit of a different discussion, but that's just another example where I think this comes in. And it's similar with morality. We don't have to reify morality as if it's some sort of thing that exists somewhere. It's quite a complex phenomenon which can be realized in different forms, and in the particular form that humans are in, I think that that takes the form of human well-being. But there's other types of well-being as well that then could be relevant for different types of organisms. And people get confused about different levels of description that they're talking about. If humans were ants, I think human morality would be very different, but that doesn't in some way undermine the nature of morality. It just means that there's different levels of abstraction that you're talking about. Anyway, but that's discussion for another time. So I'm getting close to home here, and my phone and headphones are both running out of power, so I probably should stop streaming before it just cuts out. So hopefully this long hour and 20-minute ramble was of use to you. If not, it was at least fun for me and made the trip home less boring. So thanks for listening, everyone. Take care. This has been probably one of the last car chats for a while, since I'm not planning on driving when I get to the US. But take care. How do I stop the stream here?